Asato ma satkamaya, tamaso ma jyotirgamaya, mrityorma amritam gamaya, avirāvirmayeti, rudrayatte dakshinam mukham, tena mam pahi nityam. May the Divine lead us from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from death to immortality. May the Divine Consciousness fill our hearts and protect us. We continue with our study of Karma Yoga in chapter 3. In the verse that we finished last week, verse 25, Krishna tells Arjuna that although an enlightened being has no need to work, still the enlightened being beyond all duties, the enlightened being should still work in order to set an example for others. And that's what we see in the lives of all these great ones whom we see as enlightened. How much work Shankaracharya did, Ramakrishna, Buddha, Vivekananda. They didn't have any duty, they were already free. And yet they continued to work to set an example to others. The only duty, if you want to call it in quote-unquote duty, that an enlightened being has is really to help the world, although they don't see it as a duty, as I said. So, for the enlightened, this is the teaching that Krishna gives. Verse 26, Na buddhi bhedam janayet ajnanam karma sanginam yojayet sarva karmani vidvan yuktas samacharan. The thinking of the ignorant who are attached to work should not be unsettled. The enlightened should engage them in work by themselves doing work intently. And this is the kind of a recurring theme that occurs in books. And that is that while we are often asked to shape our lives the way that enlightened beings are, because they are the exemplars, we follow in their footsteps. But there is a big difference, clearly, obviously, between the enlightened and the unenlightened. And we have often seen on earlier occasions, what this means is an enlightened being lives like an enlightened being effortlessly. But the rest of us who are unenlightened, who are trying to learn by looking at the life of the enlightened, we have to make an effort to live like as if, now that as if phrase is important, as if we are already enlightened. And that is why these texts give the characteristics of the enlightened, that this is how an enlightened being is. And looking at our life and our way of thinking, we know we are quite far from that. But then the question is, can I make an effort to change the way I think about myself, about the world, about my responsibilities? Can I change it? And how should I change it? Change it the way they changed it. And so, in a way, kind of imitating these great ones. But the problem with imitation is that these great ones are great not just by how they do things externally. A real change has occurred internally. And imitating the internal change always needs more hard work than just the external things. And so, it is possible that many people might end up doing things the way an enlightened being does only externally, not seeing the corresponding internal change. And that's the problem in any kind of imitation. In fact, there is this one book that Swami Vivekananda carried with him throughout his wandering days, The Imitation of Christ. It's an amazing book. And what it shows is that if we want to build our life the way the life of Jesus was, or to build our life the way the life of Buddha was or Ramakrishna was, then we have to see kind of almost enter inside them to see how their mind was working. And that's not easy. And one of the reasons we pray, we meditate, because that's the time that that opens up a door, so to speak, to not simply look at a picture of Ramakrishna externally, but when we meditate on him, we are not just looking at the outer appearance of Ramakrishna, but almost like as if going inside. And that's how, when we intently focus on these ideals, somehow it's through the process of osmosis, somehow those characteristics begin to enter within us. And so that's why this verse said, the thinking of the ignorant who are attached to work should not be unsettled. So how will it get unsettled? Now, if an enlightened being, when they teach, they have to come down a few notches from the heights that their mind dwells in. Otherwise, they would be totally unintelligible to people. Sri Ramakrishna says that when he had these experiences, he said those experiences could not be put into words. But of course, there were people around. They needed to hear what he was saying. But he says, the moment I open my mouth to speak, I've already come down 100 or 1,000 steps below that level. And so all the descriptions of these experiences that we see are at best approximations, because any experience itself can never be put into words. What to speak about experience of God? Simply, even experience of drinking a coffee, for instance. You drink a good cup of coffee, and then someone asks you, how was the coffee? What are you going to say? You're going to say, oh, this was delicious. This was wonderful. You might use all these adjectives, and you get some idea, but those adjectives are very inadequate to actually convey the experience of coffee. Now, if even an experience of thing like this is impossible to put into words, what to speak about those very high, subtle experiences that the mystics had. And therefore, it's necessary. Sometimes it just the expression itself will bring their mind down, but they have to also kind of put themselves almost into the shoe of the student. And that's what good teachers do. If they dwell on these great heights and then they see a lot of the students just may have no idea what the person is talking about. And so a lot of these good teachers we have had throughout history, what they have done is they try to see the world not only through their eyes, but how these people in front of me, how they are seeing the world. Only then a communication becomes possible. And that's what is meant by saying that thinking should not be unsettled. So the simple way of putting that is, think about it this way. If a student who is in middle school wants to study physics, now that's good. We want our children to start studying these subjects from very young age. But we know that the lessons or the books or the syllabus that we have for a middle school student and to a high school student and one in college and one in postgraduate, we know that the syllabus is different and they are all studying physics. But the subtlety, the nuances will vary according to the more maturity that they have and the depth of knowledge that they have. And therefore, when an enlightened being teaches the unenlightened, they should see at what level the student is and kind of give them, gently take them step by step to a higher level. Because otherwise, there is a story they sometimes say, there was all these villagers who are very religious minded. They had gathered for a religious gathering, and then this great scholar came to speak to them, and he just begins by saying, you are all Brahman. And these poor villagers, oh, yes. I mean, they just trust the words of this person. They said, oh, yes, we are Brahman. Now, please tell us, now, next, what we should do. And that's what happens. If you give this kind of the highest teaching to someone who is not yet ready for that teaching, if that person doesn't understand it, not much damage is done. But usually, we not only don't understand what is beyond our wherever we are in our evolution, we may misunderstand the teaching. That really sets us back quite a lot. And therefore, said the thinking of the ignorant who are attached to work should not be unsettled. The enlightened should engage them in work by themselves doing work intently. So when we see Krishna doing work, Buddha doing work, Ramakrishna, Vivekananda doing work, we know that yes, doing work is a good idea. And then they will tell us how we should work, which is the right way to work, which is the wrong way to work. Rather than if they would have said, oh, we are enlightened, we just don't need to do anything, then others will say, all right, we also don't need to do anything. Buddha didn't do anything, Shankara didn't do anything. And that's the idea here behind setting an example to others. Now, the next question, the more important one, is why is it that those who are not enlightened yet, the ignorant people, how do they get attached to work? Why do they get attached to work? And that's described in verse 27. Prakritev kriyamanani gunai karmani sarvashah ahankara vimudhatma kartaham iti manyate. All actions are performed by the gunas of Prakriti. One who is deluded by egoism thinks, I am the doer. So the word guna is going to come again and again and again throughout the Gita. Gunas, as most of you are aware, are said to be these three attributes associated with everything in this universe, of this material universe. Prakriti is nature or the material universe. And these three attributes are Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas. And they have been described, and they will be described in the Gita again. Rajas is the principle of activity, Tamas is the principle of inertia, and Sattva is that wonderful balance between the two, the one which opens the door to knowledge and higher understanding. So everything in this world, material object, ideas, habits, the later chapters in the Gita, you will have whole sections, how everything can be done either in a sattvic way or in a tamasic way or in a rajasic way. So we'll come to all those details later on. Right now it's enough to know that this entire world that we are experiencing manifests in these three dimensions, if you like, or three attributes. The word guna can be considered also as qualities. The word has been translated in many different ways. No translation is perfect, but you could just say these are the different ways material nature might show itself. The word guna in Sanskrit has another meaning. That means it's a rope. And we know if you want to tie someone, you tie them with a rope. And so gunas are what bind us. And that's exactly what this word says. All actions are performed by the gunas of Prakriti. One who is deluded by egoism thinks, I am the doer. So Prakriti, everything other than that ultimate reality, everything other than pure consciousness is Prakriti. Now Prakriti is both. It's the object as well as the instrument. By object is meant all these, generally in Vedanta they speak about the 5 primary elements. The Akasha, Vayu, Agni, Jal and Prithvi. In Sanskrit, in English that would be space, air, fire, water and earth. Now, we're using words, but here by earth and water is not meant the water, not this water that I have here. It means it's a different potentialities. The space Yes, of course, we have some idea of what space is, but here the first element to appear in creation was not space as we experience it, but the potentiality of space. From that potentiality came the potentiality of air, the next evolution. Everything is becoming a little bit more tangible. Space is the most intangible thing that we can think of. Air becomes slightly more tangible than that. Then from that comes light or fire. From that comes then water, the principle, the liquid. And then from that then comes finally the solid. And so all these are considered objects. Also the sense objects such as sight, sound, smell, taste, all of these are the objects which are also part of Prakriti. And then there are the instruments that will grasp these objects. And these instruments are clearly the mind, the intellect, the ego, plus also the senses, the senses of knowledge and the senses of action. So the nature itself is composed of these two primary things, the objects and the instruments that grasp these objects. And all of that comes under the word Prakriti. So ahankara vimudhatma, one person who is deluded by ahankara, egoism, thinks I am the doer. This will be explained in the subsequent verse, that none of us really is doing anything. And one way right away I can just say, for instance now, if I have this book and I can imagine that this is the book, this is really a folder. And then I could say, oh, I'm reading a book. Now that's a simple statement. You might say, well, you're being honest, you're reading a book. But now if you just step back and then say, what is exactly happening here? Well, one thing is clearly there is this human body, which is a part of this material world, holding it in hand, a part of the body. This is also again a part of this material world. It is made up of atoms and molecules. Holding in his hand this object called the book, which is also made of atoms and molecules and a part of this world. Now, reading, what is the act of reading? Is this eyes, again, a part of this world? You know the whole mechanism of perception, how the light goes and it's reflected in the retina, goes to the optic nerve and so on. Everything in this act of reading is a material entity. And yet, the knowledge is that I'm reading. How is I'm reading? It's just these material particles, this material particle, just these particles are just acting and interacting with each other. How does that lead to the conclusion that I'm the reading? So that's why this Gita says, who is this I? Where does this I come into the picture at all? And that's really what is pointed out in this verse. That one who is deluded by egoism thinks, I am the doer. All the actions are occurring in these material particles of the world, and somehow that's our delusion, that's our ignorance, that I think I'm doing anything. This will be clarified in the next verse. So how does the enlightened work? Verse 28. Tattvavittu mahabaho gunakarma vibhagayoho guna guneshu vartante iti matva na sajjate. But one who understands the distinction between guna and karma does not get attached, recognizing that gunas merely dwell on gunas. Gunas as senses dwell on gunas as objects. That's what I was saying, that these gunas, this sense of perception is interacting with these gunas which have taken the form of a book. And yet, because the enlightened person knows that it is just one set of gunas interacting with other gunas, and therefore they don't get attached because they understand that distinction. So understanding distinction between guna and karma, the example that comes to mind is think about Say, many of us, nowadays, most of us work with computers in one form or another, and we sometimes say, print this document. And clearly, you have a good printer and it's working, and so you know how to print a document. And then after the document is printed, then you say, I printed it. Now, what has exactly happened here? So think about it this way. The software in your computer, the software in your printer, that's the instrument, that's the gunas. The hardware printer and also the paper are also gunas, so also these are all material, but that's the object. So essentially, the activity that is occurring, printing of a document that's occurring, is this software interacting with the hardware, the senses interacting with the object. That's how this karma occurs, activity occurs, action occurs, with two software, hardware interacting with each other, activities occurring. And at the end of it, I say, I have printed the document. I have done nothing. The software and hardware did everything. Where does I printing the document comes in? That's the problem. This is a little bit easier to understand, but now that's happening with every little activity that we do, small and big, from morning to night, and also in our dreams. We are not doing anything. And so when we speak about the ideal of being the witness, that's good. That's a good practice. But it's also a very advanced practice. And so we should not take it lightly, because being a witness is tough. It's not easy. And the word witness here is not in the kind of a general way the word witness gets used. I mean, there are witnesses, there is a crime and there are witnesses. Not in that sense. Here, witness means two things. First, you are aware of what's happening. You have seen or heard or what. But the other important quality for a witness is that you are not reacting to it. That's even more tougher. So in a sense, if the camera is really a good witness. A camera is, unfortunately, from our perspective, is not a conscious being. But a camera sees things, never reacts to it. But you and I mean, this is kind of a natural camera that we have. We are able to capture visuals the way a camera captures visuals. But this camera, the camera we are born with, it's very difficult not to react. You look at a beautiful sunrise, it's so difficult to just witness. You are going to say, oh, that's beautiful. Or something is like, that's lousy. We judge, we are judging all the time. Judging is a form of reaction. So being a witness is not easy. Now, oftentimes when we use the word witness, we are also just thinking about what is happening around me. But here, being a witness is not simply seeing something outside, but seeing something inside as well. Actually, these words outside and inside are so meaningless in some ways. Because when we use the word outside, the question, outside what? And generally, we've got to acknowledge, we somehow thinks it's like this. Just like there are national boundaries, where one boundary of one sovereign state ends and the next, somebody else's property begins. Or the boundary of your home, your property and someone else's property. Then you can speak about this as inside my property and that's outside my property. So when we speak about looking outside and inside, usually our boundary is this body. Because then we say everything outside this body, which is not me, that's outside and inside. But being a witness, there is nothing inside. Because the witness is the most innermost being. So everything is outside. In other words, I should not only be a witness of what's happening in the world, can I be a witness of my own body? Can I be a witness of my own mind, of every thought rising and falling in my mind, every emotion, every feeling coming and going from my mind? You see, it's difficult enough to be just a witness of the things happening in the world. Open the paper or look at the television or see the news, and we either get upset, mostly upset, or sometimes happy. So difficult to be just neutral. If that is so difficult of the things happening outside, think about things which are so personal, so deep inside, again, inside. Can I be a witness of that? It's even more difficult. And so, yes, being a witness is a great thing. And we should all try to do that. But we should also recognize it's one of the most difficult practices in life. We should strive to do that, but also acknowledge what is expected of us to be a witness in the truest sense of the term. So, verse 29. This comes back to that idea of why the enlightened being should not unsettle the understanding of the ignorant. Verse 29. Prakriter gunasam mudhaha sajjante gunakarmasu tana kritsna vido mandan kritsna vinna vichalayet. Those who are deluded by the function of the gunas of Prakriti attach themselves to the work of the gunas. The enlightened should not confuse such dull people of limited understanding. Mandan. I mean, this is a rather a euphemism, just calling them mandan, dull people. In many other places, they use even stronger words. Sometimes they're just stupid people and so on. And yeah, it can be seems like a very uncharitable way to describe it, not even politically correct in our today's sensibilities. But these people did not mince any words. If you are dull, you are dull. There is no need to camouflage that understanding. And so, attach themselves to the work of the gunas means by imagining we are doing the work. As I gave you the example of the printer, the software is interacting with the hardware. They are doing everything, whatever is being done, and I say, I printed the document. That is what it meant by saying being attached themselves to the work of the gunas. The enlightened should not confuse such dull people of limited understanding. Now, I have mentioned this briefly. Not confuse means the teaching should be given according to the fitness of the student in stages, gradually. This can become difficult, especially in a group setting. And that's why, and I probably mentioned this earlier, that everything in this world is a mixed blessing. Every good thing that occurs also has some downside to it. And one example clearly, I probably mentioned it last Sunday, I think, that in the olden days, when there were no books, it was not easy to get knowledge. To learn, student had to go to the home of the teacher. And sometimes, no cars that time, no internet, you had to physically walk all the way. And wild animals in the middle. And then, of course, there were so many hurdles. Then you go to the teacher's place. And if the teacher usually will say, okay, just stay here and go and do some work. You say, no, I came to study. There's no such thing. You just have to obey and just wait for that when the teacher's grace will come and the teacher will say, okay, now come and sit. This is the first lesson. So the teacher could see where the student was and give a lesson appropriate to that stage of the student's growth. then make the student practice it, then give the next lesson, then give the next lesson. So it was slow, but it was thorough. And it helped the student go step by step by step. But that is the benefit, but the difficulty was finding a teacher, finding a source of learning, and so on. Today, things have changed quite a lot. Today, there is the internet, there is printing, there are books. Accessibility to information is much, much easier than what it was even during our parents' or great-grandparents' time. So that's the blessing part of it. The downside to that is, with easy accessibility, who is going to then help me decide what is appropriate for me at this stage of my development? Now, when we are very young, some amount of guidance comes from parents. Parents will usually tell their children or make sure that they have these the books they read, the programs they see. Nowadays, many computers come with parental controls. So that's a recognition of the idea that it needs control. And so when we are very young, there are people in our lives, usually the elders in the family, who will make sure that something appropriate for our age and interest is given to us. But very quickly, once we become teenagers, even if that guidance is available, somehow we don't want that guidance. We think I'm smart enough to know what I want. And then, of course, this kind of very aggressive sense of individual freedom is such like, who is anyone to tell me? I can read what I want. It sounds great, but that can be sometimes not to our advantage, especially if we haven't developed enough understanding of who I am, what I need, what's good for me. It's helpful to get guidance from those who love me, who want me to succeed, rather than me deciding something. And so that's the problem today. The easy accessibility of information, I can read 100 books, understand probably only one or two among them, misunderstand 98 others. It becomes such a hodgepodge in my head. And then I feel like, oh, I've read so much. Why is it I'm so confused? And so what this teaching shows us, it's not the amount of reading that I do. It's not the amount of information I put in my head. Even if I have relatively less information, even if I have relatively fewer ideas, what is more important is that those ideas that I have in my head, I know how they are connected. It's like a pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. I know where each piece fits in. Then that will lead to some kind of knowledge, will lead to some kind of wisdom. Otherwise, it will just information, just thousands of unrelated pieces of a puzzle. I don't know where they fit. They are just like spread all over. It's chaotic. And therefore, reading too much, putting too many ideas may be counterproductive. And that's why we have to be careful. If we have guidance, that's great. Otherwise, we have to depend on our own good judgment to decide, this is what I want to do in life. These are the sources that will give me the information I need. Then I can actually see some progress, some movement towards the goal. Otherwise, it would be tragic if years pass from my life, I read a lot, I hear a lot, and then I have never had time then to look and say, what has all this reading and think, what has it made me? Has it taken me anywhere nearer, closer to the goal that I have? And that is why It says, those who are deluded by the function of the gunas of Prakriti attach themselves to the work of the gunas. The enlightened should not confuse such dull people of limited understanding. And that is why the enlightened people should give the teaching appropriate to that level of fitness of the student. And so this kind of concludes that portion which I mentioned earlier, which we began with, verse 26. Should not unsettle their understanding. That portion gets more fleshed out here in verse 29. And so that is the reason why we see these enlightened beings doing work, because they themselves have no need for it, but they do it to set an example to others. So looking at them of how they work, we then learn how we can shape and mold our own lives. So we'll stop here. If you have any comments, questions, thoughts, feel free. Yeah.
Hari Om Swamiji. Swamiji, we often think as newborn and children as being somewhat closer to God in some of their qualities. Mm-hmm. Do they also have all three gunas?
Oh yes, absolutely. Yeah. We think of them as closer to God. Let's see. A lot of it is because some of the hurdles or obstacles, so some of the weaknesses that they have brought with them from their previous lives, there's no chance for it to manifest to a little baby. And so all that we see really, externally at least, are all the characteristics of an enlightened being. If an enlightened being is in samadhi for 18 hours in a day, a little baby is asleep 18 hours in a day, completely unaware of the world. And samadhi is the state of being unaware of the world. A little baby has no anxiety, no worry, no sleepless nights. But such is the case with the enlightened being also. So yes, in some external characteristics, that's how a little baby looks. And then, of course, when this baby becomes a teenager, then we say, what happened to all that godlike qualities I saw in this person just a few years ago? And so, yes. Yeah.
Namaste, Swamiji. So, Swamiji, you said about gunas that is affecting. So, how much of the gunas that are impacting you and making you do certain things as opposed to what you may have affected in your past life that is impacting you now? So, there is a kind of like some interactions there, right? Because otherwise, the gunas by themselves will only affect you based on what you had done in the past.
No, I think you're mixing up guna and samskara. They're two different things.
Okay.
The gunas are not making you do anything. In fact, the whole point is you're not doing anything. All activities occurring in the gunas.
But we think
but because I am attached to those gunas, because even these are also gunas, but these certain atoms and molecules in the material universe, I have decided this is me. This is not me. This is the table. Essentially, these set of molecules are not me. This set of molecules is me. That's a choice. That's a decision I made. That's what makes me ignorant. Now, because this is me, the mind, which is also another prakriti, matter, I think that's my mind. Now, every action that occurs leaves an impression on that mind. That impression is samskara. And that impression then influences my future actions. Gunas are just there. They are just playing among themselves. To some extent, you can think, please say, to some extent, we can think in terms of, let's say, the Red Sox are playing with Yankees. And all these fans are sitting in the watching and getting affected. Now, these fans are really not doing anything, they're just sitting there. The actual playing, the actual action is occurring with the players who are doing it. But because these people have gotten completely identified with them, so when these people play well and win, then these people, when they come out of the Fenway Park, they say, "Today we won." No, you didn't win, you were just sitting there. But if you're identified with them, you kind of attach and say, "You did it, we won, we defeated them." Exactly in the same way, even in this, who is holding this? And I will say, "Well, I'm holding it. I'm not doing anything. Is this body is holding this iPad in the hand. But because I have made this determination that this is me, that's why I feel I am doing it. That's how I'm ascribing the activity to me." You get the point? Yeah. Yeah.
Now it's clear.
Yeah.
That's very clear.
Yeah.
Namaskar, Swamiji. Just following up on a question. Certain people have tamasic personalities. I mean, tamasic guna overrides their sattvic or rajvic gunas.
A little come closer to the mic and say. Yeah.
So this is my understanding of gunas, that certain people are more tamasic and certain people are more sattvic, and that is just how they are. Is that correct? Or
No,
we don't...
Yeah,
we-
today we haven't come to that sattva rajas at all, other than saying that these gunas are present in all, and the preponderance of one or the other is what makes a difference.
Right.
But nobody is like permanently sattvic or permanently tamasic.
But isn't that a particular person's rajvic or sattvic personality dependent on their sanskar? That they are carrying this through from a previous birth or previous life?
No.
No?
No. Samskara, and I think you'll have to read that little better. The samskara and guna are two different things.
But the manifestation, don't certain sanskars manifest in your personality? Like
Yes,
when you-
samskaras are the impressions made on the mind.
Right, and they manifest. So you see somebody who looks enlightened, or so you think they had a good last birth also, because they're carrying those sanskars through. And doesn't that manifest in their gunas, like how they present to the public? No?
No, it's not clear. Please sit down. The gunas are the way everything in this material world shows itself. And as I said, the very simple way to understand that, and it's the simplistic way actually, is anything that is, which predominantly has this principle of activity, movement, excitement, and that is considered associated with the rajas or rajasic. That which is the principle of inertia, it's considered tamasic. And as I said, the middle portion, the sattvic, is really the ideal state for spiritual growth. And it's a very dynamic equilibrium. It's not a fixed thing. It's not like we are born with certain fixed genes of tamas and fixed genes of sattva. Every particle in this universe has all these three potentialities at the same time. And that's why there are phases in our life or phases during the day. Part of the day we might feel extremely lazy. Then we might get very active. And it's not as if I'm lazy in the morning, every morning I'm lazy. Maybe some mornings I may be active. So it's not determined in that sense. But all these three potentialities are present. And if I want to make spiritual progress, I must consciously try to develop the sattva within us. And all that detailed discussion will come in the Gita later on. Yes.
Namaskar, Swamiji. Swamiji, when you were describing the witness eye as taking a zoomed out lens on this, basically your eye is not there and you are, there's just an observation that's occurring without an eye. But actually, a part of me feels that the deepest truth is that only God exists, right?
Mm-hmm.
So even viewing something as, oh, this material body is viewing these other material particles with all of these distinctions, actually the deepest truth is that there is only Him, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so when we talk about, again, higher or lower, no matter how much I say there is no higher or lower, I do feel that is the highest. Is that kind of a wrong assumption I'm holding on to, or really kind of narrow-minded?
It's not narrow-minded. It just shows, again, we were speaking about samskaras. So these are some of the deep impressions in the mind that we have. Because actually there is a kind of a contradiction involved here. If everything is God, then there cannot be any higher and lower. So on one side, a part of me acknowledges that everything is divine, but then there's this other part in me which is still kind of being weighed down by these ideas and concepts I have about what is higher, what is lower, what is better, what is not better. So there is actually, and that's what creates this inner stress. A part of me kind of acknowledges the highest truth, but as far as my experience is concerned, it's still kind of being held back by these impressions. And that kind of stress and tension is actually good. It just shows that I know this is the ideal, this is where I am, and what I should do then to reach that ideal. It just shows me the gap between my intellectual understanding or my feeling about how the highest idea is, but what my actual day-to-day experience is. And so every spiritual seeker will have to kind of live with that tension. And if we keep on struggling and say, if I am convinced that the way I see things now are not really the way they are, then I need to kind of day by day try to evolve. Yeah. Anish? Yeah.
Pranam Swamiji, I had a question along the same lines. I think you mostly answered it, but if you try to be the witness, you say it's a good practice, but it's not an easy practice to do correctly. But in some sense, that seems to be for all the spiritual practices. Like if you're not naturally bhakta, for instance, it doesn't seem easy to do that either. And it seems like you can, kind of make an approximate, attempt at it, and then, as time goes on, you become more of a bhakta. Sure. In that sense. And so it sounds like there's no harm in trying these practices, right? It's just that just to be aware that you're not doing it perfectly.
Yeah, I totally agree with you that yes, every practice has its challenges. What we need to guard against is, because sometimes we do see people speaking glibly about, just being a witness. And I just wanted to caution that it is an advanced state. So even if when we are attempting to be a witness, it's also good to acknowledge that we're not a perfect witness yet. We are still a work in progress, a perfect witness to be at some point in future. I'm trying to be a perfect witness. Okay? Yeah. All right. So we will stop here today. Om Jananim Saradam Devim Ramakrishnam Jagadgurum Padapadme Tayo Shritva Pranamami Muhurmuhu.